From what I can tell, it didn't go well. I remember the car being incredibly small and was mainly used by my mother to drive me and my sister to preschool and kindergarten until it was destroyed in a pretty severe car crash that luckily no one was injured in. My dad, meanwhile, had an only slightly larger car, a silver Chevy Monza. As far as cars went, they were both pretty ugly and cheap, but not atypical of the sort of things that a young dual-income couple with 2 small kids might own in the 1980s. We moved to a larger house when I was about 5, and soon after, we also upgraded our cars. My dad got what we called the big car, which was a very popular model of the time, a blue Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. It felt incredibly spacious compared to the car and the Monza, and this became the new family car, the one we would drive on family outings to restaurants or to visit relatives, and the one that we would load up with all of our kid junk when we went to the beach or the pool, or when my parents were driving a bunch of my friends to a birthday party or something. My mother, meanwhile, replaced the busted car with a red Toyota Celica, which she bought used from one of her teacher friends at the school where she worked. I remember that people we knew would often make a big deal about us having a red car in a very passive-aggressive, middle-class sort of way. You know, the idea that a red car was very showy and associated with driving fast, and these were not the sorts of things that you would expect from a respectable middle-class mom. I remember my grandfather seeing it for the first time and making jokes about how my mother was going to be a NASCAR driver or something, even though the Celica is a pretty modest car, all things considered. That same grandfather was pretty well off and was always buying slick new cars for himself, while the cars that my parents owned were always used. At some point in the mid-90s, my grandfather sold my parents his tan Honda Accord to replace the Oldsmobile. And then a few years after that, they bought a silver Ford Taurus from him to replace the Celica. And I remember thinking that these cars felt very cool and contemporary compared to what we had before. They drove smoother, they had more understated colors, they had soft leather seats, they could play CDs instead of cassette tapes, and they had powerful air conditioning for the summer, which in those days was a pretty big novelty, especially here in the temperate Pacific Northwest. These cars felt very much like part of the modern world, as opposed to the other cars that all felt like relics from the 70s or something. When I started to learn to drive around the turn of the millennium, I always felt proud driving the Accord or the Taurus, and then eventually the second Taurus that we got to replace the Accord. I thought that these cars broadcast to my friends that my family could afford nice, modern things, with this sort of keeping up with the Joneses insecurity being one of the common themes of my middle-class youth. And in that sense, shifting to Ford sedans, which my parents still more or less exclusively buy to this day, also symbolized the degree that my family seemed to be doing better for themselves in the late 90s overall, which was a time when our standard of living seemed to be increasing in all sorts of ways, as we shall see.
Ford Taurus, built to last, built for the way you live.
So, I never got my own car. For a lot of kids, that's a very important rite of passage, and I'm sure it's something that a lot of you guys will have strong memories of. But for me, throughout my 20s, I would mostly just drive one of my parents' cars, often desperately negotiating with them when I needed it for this or that particular weekend in the stereotypical suburban kid sort of way. When I moved out in my mid-20s, I transitioned into a basically car-free lifestyle, always taking the bus or the train or even just walking, which was basically just a reflection of my own personal hang-ups. I don't particularly like driving, and I know I'm not a very good driver, and once I started living on my own, I also became very cheap, and a car seemed like a needless expense, which might actually be one of the most powerfully un-middle-class things about me, just because eschewing car ownership has definitely made me fall several status points in the eyes of my middle-class peers. Taking the bus, especially, is something that I've noticed a lot of middle-class people tend to react to with horror and disgust. My mom and dad in particular will often react as if they've failed as parents whenever I make mention of my frequent use of public transportation. As far back as I can remember, there was always a color TV in the McCullough household. I have some vague memories of occasionally encountering a black and white TV when I was very young. I feel like electronic stores would sometimes sell them, and maybe like my friends' families might have a black and white TV in their guest room or something. But among middle-class people in the mid-80s, they were largely a thing of the past, incredibly backwards and uncool. Remote controls, though, I remember those being special. When I was very young, we had one TV in the house that didn't have a remote control, and one TV that did. The non-remote TV had these knobs like a washing machine that you had to manually twist to change the channels. And I remember thinking that our remote control TV, which we had downstairs in the living room, was impressively modern by contrast. I like this TV graphic that I sometimes use in my videos because it reminds me a lot of that downstairs TV with its black plastic body and smooth curved shape. In those early days, it was just two TVs in the house, the good family room TV, and then the crappy upstairs TV, which was sort of in the second family room we had up there. I'm not really sure how to describe it. I feel like it wasn't that uncommon for middle-class families in those days to have more rooms than they knew what to do with, and this would often result in things like the second, less important TV room. When I was in the first grade or so, I got a Nintendo Entertainment System after being seduced by a department store display of Super Mario 1. So my parents bought me one for Christmas, and we hooked it up to the crappy upstairs TV. I think playing Nintendo on the good downstairs TV would have been too disruptive to the family viewing habits. Now, what happened in subsequent years, I think probably mirrors what happened to a lot of middle-class families of my time. Eventually, my parents bought a new, bigger and better TV for the downstairs family room, and this triggered a shift of all of the existing TVs that are in the house. My parents put the old good TV in their bedroom, but the upstairs TV stayed put. But then, a couple years later, they got an even bigger and better TV for the downstairs, and the TVs shifted once again, with the oldest TV now going into my bedroom. In those days, I remember it being considered a little bit edgy for a kid to have a TV in his own bedroom. I was the only one of my friends who had a TV in his room, and I remember my parents being a little worried about that. I feel like the middle-class conventional wisdom of the time held that if a kid had a TV in his bedroom, he was in heightened danger of becoming an isolated, antisocial, TV-addicted weirdo, and would probably start watching adult movies at night. But my folks relented, in part because I was honestly just never that much of a TV kid. And in any case, the TV that I had was so old by that point, and the picture quality was so bad, that I never wanted to watch anything on it anyway. It was exclusively my Nintendo TV. Now, I don't know if my family is coming off as wealthy because of all these TVs we had, but if we are, I will just note that we definitely cut corners when it came to TV accessories. We didn't have cable for a long time, for instance. Only the crappy, basic Canadian channels, not the exciting and glamorous American channels that I could only watch when I went to my friends' places. My father in particular was pretty indifferent to one of the great status scrambles of 90s era middle-class dads, which was seeing who could get the most extravagant cable package and pack their TVs with the most exciting American channels. And this then culminated in the great satellite dish arms race. Satellite dishes, I remember always thinking of as this incredibly decadent luxury of the wealthy elite. I had this one friend named Patrick, and he and his family lived in this big house up in the mountains with tons of pointless rooms. And they had this gigantic satellite dish that had its own little dedicated corner in the backyard. Because of course theirs was so big it couldn't even be mounted on the side of the house, like the dishes of lesser families. The McCulloughs also weren't that big into home video. We had a VCR for a while, but then it broke and we just never got a new one. We would see movies in the theater once in a while, but overall I just grew up in a house that wasn't obsessed with movies the way that other families were. And to this day, movies are by far my biggest cultural blind spot. I find it hard to relate to like millennials who had some super dog-eared copy of The Empire Strikes Back on VHS and they watched it so many times that they had all the lines memorized. I never had a relationship with any movie like that. VCR movies were something that I associated less with my own family and more something that I would do when I would go to other people's houses for like a sleepover or something. That sort of thing feels like something that's a much smaller part of middle-class culture these days. The idea of different families owning different types of technology. When I was growing up, it felt like new forms of technology were being invented very quickly, quicker than most families could keep up with or afford. So different families would have different things, and going to someone's house was always a bit of a thrill because you'd get to experience whatever one piece of expensive experimental modern technology that they had decided to go